Hello, everyone, and welcome to Relic Law's Interview with an Expert series. I'm Willie Morlowitz, Principal Attorney at Relic Law. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Nathan Regola. Nathan is a security architect with Relic Law and president of Regola Cyber. Nathan holds a PhD in computer science and engineering from the University of Notre Dame and a Juris Doctorate from the George Washington University School of Law. Nathan is also a certified CMMC assessor and CMMC provisional instructor. Nathan's work focuses on advising DoD and federal contractors on cybersecurity, governance, risk, and compliance. Nathan joins us today to discuss how organizations seeking CMMC certification can get prepared on a budget. So, Nathan, welcome. We're excited for this conversation.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here, and a lot of great questions are queued up.
Awesome. Well, let's just go ahead and dive right in and open with the first question. So Nathan, a lot of people just want to know, CMMC has been around for a little bit now, and obviously the rules that underlie it have been around even longer. Why do you think so many DoD contractors are still struggling with, the CMMC and getting ready?
I think it's a few things. So, first, as you noted, the NIST 171 rules that underpin the security requirements have been around for quite some time. But if you think back to the self-assessment days and even today when companies are filling out their SPURS score, if you don't have a really in-depth understanding of the requirements, you can be kind of led astray, by your lack of understanding and think, hey, we have 100%. This is pretty easy. Why do we have to do more? And so I think that's part of it. And the other part, I think, is perhaps the perceived lack of focus by the Department of Defense on kind of advertising and marketing that CMMC is real and it's going to happen, and that companies need to take it seriously. If you look at the documentation, it's not always that comprehensive. And I think that leads people to not think about how that applies to their environment. And the more you can refer back to NIST 153 kind of consulting experience, the more it will put it into focus about what's actually at stake. And while it's less stringent than FedRAMP, it is a lot of work for companies to be prepared and to build an SSP and an environment that will survive assessment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And one of the things we found is that a lot of companies, even some of the larger ones, don't necessarily have the in-house expertise in order to, really tackle their CMMC effort. Do you think that that's a challenge, basically a lack of skills and sort of knowledge within organizations, and basically struggling with the material itself?
I do, and I think that's, I'm not trying to bash other compliance frameworks, and I'm not going to name them, but if you think about the NIST 153 requirements, which they kind of cherry picked some of those requirements for NIST 171, the federal government treats the rules very seriously, right? And it has a certain fidelity to the intent and the rigor of documentation, and not every compliance framework has that. And so I think that kind of lack of rigor in a lot of frameworks, or maybe creative ability to kind of design your own, that a lot of frameworks have, is lacking in CMMC, and it's lacking intentionally. And I think that creates the gap. Unless you have that background, you're going to approach it from probably the compliance frameworks that and CMMC is not like the frameworks that you probably know.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that once people are more exposed to it, they realize that there's a fairly large delta in the rigor of CMMC versus those other compliance frameworks that are, really popular in industry. And so I think that you're right, that makes it a challenge for organizations that simply don't have, the personnel with the background, in order to lead those efforts. So with that, let's jump on to question 2. So, I know that you and I have spoken a lot about this over the past year or so, but can you talk about why organizations should think about scoping, and why is it important to the assessment itself?
Yeah, absolutely. as we've talked a lot about, this being, kind of one of the most overlooked phases of, consulting and assessment planning. And it's so critical because ultimately, you can kind of think of it like a WOT survey. You have to give that to the assessment team so they can estimate the cost of your assessment and understand what you're trying to have assessed, right? So for example, are you assessing Linux systems or Mac systems? You tell the assessment team that so that they make sure they have an assessor that's familiar with Linux and Mac on the team to assess you. And if you don't disclose that you have Linux and Mac and they don't have people lined up to assess you, assessment's not going to go well, right? It's going to get drawn out. Going to be potentially cost changes. So that's the business side of it, right? Is you want to be able to outline what you have so you can get an accurate quote and a reasonable project schedule for the assessment. The important security and compliance side of it is that, some of the requirements are assessed at a different level of rigor by the CMMC assessment process, which is still draft. So that will eventually be approved by DoD and final, but it's currently draft. So when we speak about the CMMC assessment process or the CAP, it is a draft. So these comments are based on the draft that's publicly available. But different asset classifications are assessed differently. So if you don't have a good scope of your information system, which should include the type of asset. So for example, does it store CUI? Is it a security protection asset? Is it a contractor risk managed asset? Is it a specialized asset? And then what happens is people will say, well, does multi-factor authentication need to be on this system? Well, it depends what the asset classification is and what your company policies are. So if you start with scoping and you understand where the data is flowing and you can appropriately classify the asset types, then you're in a much better position to actually build a solid SSP and understand where the requirements are going to apply. So for example, answering the questions about which type of systems need multi-factor authentication, because you don't want to document that systems have it if they don't, right? Because that's likely to get discovered during assessment. You may not want to put that in place where it's not required, but you do want it in place where it is required. So if you scope first, the rest of your consulting engagement and your future assessment is going to be much smoother.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I think that there are, I think that people tend to rush in to CMMC and they immediately start to focus on the practices rather than looking at scoping. And I don't think that many people, who are sort of approaching this hastily have looked at the CAP. They don't understand the asset classifications, which do have nuance to them. And there is, some expertise in interpreting, how assets should be classified, if you will. And I think even organizations struggle with just their CUI data flows and knowing where CUI is in their environment, and as well as understanding how they're authenticating against various assets. And so I think all of those can affect scoping. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Let's jump into question 3. So, what are the challenges of using external service providers, and what should OSCs do if they have them? I know this comes up a lot because there are questions of inheritance, and organizations don't really understand what that means. Can you speak to this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely a hot button issue. It's a lot of traction on LinkedIn and some of the other platforms. At a high level, you should think about an external service provider is an organization that's providing something to an OSC. It could be a data center provider, it could be a managed service provider, could be a managed service, security service provider, etc. At the end of the day, the way I like to think about it is, it's not really reasonable that the government's going to allow you to outsource a service with less requirements than you would have to fulfill if you performed the function in-house, right? If that were the case, then I could just outsource everything to Will, right? Will could outsource everything to me, and we both say, wow, we didn't do anything. That's great. Let's go for assessment, right? It doesn't make sense. So you have to make sure that the people you are outsourcing to are meeting the policies that you've created, or you have to adjust your policies, right? If you think you have leeway to make your policy less stringent because your service provider can't meet your internal policy. You can adjust your policy or have an exception for that service provider, but you actually have to validate that they're doing what they say they're going to be doing, because in most cases they're probably not going to have a FedRAMP moderate or higher certification or CMMC certification at this point. And in addition to FedRAMP moderate certification, they can have an equivalence letter, which is essentially they've undergone assessment by a FedRAMP third-party assessor, and they've been issued a letter stating that they have practices equivalent to FedRAMP moderate. That's pretty rare, but it certainly is possible.
Yeah, given the level of effort and amount of time it takes to actually review all the external service providers or third parties that might be swept up into your CUI, information system boundary, it suggests to me that organizations really need to have a long runway in order to evaluate that and then make strategic decisions about whether certain service providers will be removed or replaced, et cetera. Do you think that that's a challenge for OSCs?
Yes, absolutely. And I love how we're taking it back to the scoping, right? Because it's absolutely correct. If you don't do a solid job scoping, and at the 11th hour you realize you have these external service providers, you're liable to be in quite a bit of trouble, right? Because you mentioned inheritance, right? So what can you do if you're an OSC? And you're hinting at it, right? You need to evaluate whether those external service providers, or ESPs as they're called in the CAP and the other documentation, really have the ability to work with you and kind of level up to the CMMC requirements, or whether they're not going to be good partners and you're going to have to search for alternatives. If they've never heard of CMMC, they don't know what FedRAMP is, they don't have any security documentation, it's obviously going to be a very steep hill to climb. If they're willing to do it, that's great. But starting early is definitely the key, because you want to understand what their security practices are, and then you have to jointly agree what they're responsible for and what your organization is responsible for. There's a thing called a customer responsibility matrix that's supposed to exist between the external service providers and the OSC. You can think about contractually, tying this to your agreement, right? If the company is supposed to, as an example, do background checks that are equivalent to your company's, you probably want that in a contract, right? That they're going to meet the OSC's background check requirements. And then when the assessor asks, well, are all your users background checked? You say, yes, here's our internal policy and results. And here we have this external service provider, and they contractually agreed to meet this standard and use, the following 5 providers. And the assessor said, oh, okay, that looks good, right? If they ask external service provider, do you do background checks? Yeah, we sometimes do, right? That's not a very good answer, right? So how does the OSC have any assurance that that's actually happening in every case? So
Yeah,
it's a simple example, but
no, it's a great example, and I think it highlights the value of having someone who is knowledgeable with CMMC involved in the very early scoping stages where you're looking at these types of issues, because as you mentioned, a mistake here that goes overlooked, up until the eve of the assessment, can create a real problem. And if the OSC is relying on, timely satisfaction of that certification in order to, secure certain federal business, that can end up having a significant consequence. So let's jump into question 4. So, CMMC has gone through, I think, a lot of ups and downs. Those of us who follow the space and, sort of DoD's different positions and postures at various points in time, including with the Cyber AB and its iterations. What are your thoughts, since you're so involved, as to where CMMC is today, and where do you think it's going to be as the rulemaking process continues?
certainly, obviously these are my opinions, but I think there's an interesting dynamic. I think a lot of the information out there today is somewhat driven by the way DIBCAC conducts assessments of C3PAOs and OSCs. And I'm not trying to bash DibCAC in any way. I mean, there's a lot of good feedback that's out there about them. You know, they have a job to do, right? And I think it's important to remember they're conducting these assessments of C3POs and OSCs at no cost to the OSC or C3PO, right? So they have to, I would assume, think about the budget and the risk and how they're going to conduct, you know, the assessment. As an example, if you're using a multi-factor, you know, authentication provider, you know, cloud provider, right? They're probably not going to dig into that cloud provider's security documentation in a really detailed way. Why are they doing that? Well, probably because they're familiar with that cloud provider, and from a risk perspective, you know, it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to spend, you know, a week looking at the system security plan of a software as a service, MFA provider. But if you transition that to what CMMC is supposed to be, right? The OSCs are paying for the assessments, and the CMMC assessors are supposed to, you know, carefully look at, you know, for example, the SSP of those external service providers, depending on what services they're providing, whether they're doing CUI assets, so forth, or whether it's a security protection asset, and whether they have a CMMC certification, and really understand that customer responsibility matrix in detail, and to the extent, you know, they don't have a CMMC certification, right, kind of validate the practices of that external service provider. And so to try to take this up a level, I think a lot of the conversation is focused on the way DibCAC is doing assessments. And, you know, it's important to note they're not CMMC assessments, right? They're NIST 171, you know, potentially medium or high assessments, but they're not CMMC assessments. They're not governed by the CAP. And so I hope that the CMMC assessments go in the way that I think DoD intends them to go in, which is to, you know, rigorously follow the CAP and the training that people were given to be certified assessors, and look where they're supposed to look. You know, the less intense assessment that occurs, I think the more it turns into a lighter weight, you know, assessment, and I think that's ultimately to the detriment of a nation's security, quite frankly, right? Because there are plenty of security compliance regimes out there. So if it's just supposed to be a very basic check the box, what is the purpose of CMMC? And I'm not suggesting that DibCAC is doing a check the box, but I think the risk is there that people interpret it to be, you know, the assessments can kind of go however the C3PO wants them to go. And I sincerely hope that does not occur.
Yeah, and I mean, I think DoD has had, you know, plenty of opportunities throughout this process to sort of water down or dial back CMMC, and they've been reluctant to do that, which I think suggests what you're saying is accurate. And I think that the awareness that this is needed is probably at its peak. You know, you look at what's even, you know, just transpired in the last 36 hours, for example, with, you know, obviously foreign attacks or intrusions into critical infrastructure systems across the country. So I think that this is a prescient issue. Before we jump off this slide, I know a lot of contractors, and there's a lot of opinions about this out there right now. We know that, you know, the rulemaking process for CMMC is underway. Just to kind of put your thoughts out there, when do you think, you know, these requirements will start appearing in contracts? I know we hear a lot between 12 to 18 months. Do you think that that's realistic?
I do think it's realistic once they release the rules. You know, I think if they release the rule in, you know, Q1, yeah, certainly 12 to 18 months from now is realistic.
Yeah, and I know that because some contractors have been sort of, you know, procrastinating, if you will, or hesitating to really launch into starting to prepare. And I know you and I have spoken about the risk of that being that, you know, this requires a fairly long runway depending on your existing maturity, and there's a lack of available talent to help support CMMC readiness. So, I mean, would you suggest that if a contractor's been sitting on the fence that they should get started, or?
I do. Obviously, they have the NIST 171 requirements, and certainly if they're being truthful and accurate in their SPURS score, they really don't have an issue from a SPURS score perspective. So that's one risk, I think, because I think a lot of people misinterpret the requirements and tend to score themselves higher than they actually would be scored by DIBCAC or a C3PAO. And I think there's a lot of data out there that suggests that is the case. One of the reasons why the CMMC program exists. So that's certainly a risk. And I absolutely agree that the runway is generally quite significant unless an organization has a very small infrastructure. For example, it's all cloud-based, really small scope, one or two cloud apps, and they've got ability to build the documentation. Reality is most organizations are much more complex, right? They have multiple sites, they have equipment, they have the physical security at the sites, they have multiple cloud providers, they have multiple external service providers, and when you get into that scope and you talk about potentially changing contracts with providers to get them to implement something that you want them to implement, documenting all of this, really understanding the data flows, you're talking about a significant time to do all of that, and then actually have those practices in place so that you can credibly go for assessment. Because if you think about this kind of just hypothetical company we're talking about that has multiple sites, multiple providers, this is not going to be a $5,000 assessment, right? So you don't want to go into that assessment and the employee was, just trained on something last week, and they get into the interview with 5 people and they mess up, right? They say something, well, we had an incident, 2 weeks ago, and we didn't go through our incident, plan. Well, wait a minute, what's the assessor going to do, right? So you want to have the practices in place for a little bit so that the people who are going to participate feel comfortable, and it drastically reduces your risk, right? You don't want to train somebody the day before the assessment and then hope they perform.
Yeah, no, that makes great sense. And I think you're right. When you actually look at the timing stack up from start to finish, again, depending on, how well prepared the organization is already, a year to a year and a half is not an exceptional amount of time to get everything done, and in a to a degree that you feel ready to go for a phase 1 with an assessor. And so I think organizations that have been sort of really just waiting this out, sitting on the sidelines, I think it would be prudent for them to start contemplating getting in the game in a serious way and making a commitment to setting up internal resources and looking for external resources if necessary to make headway on this. So question 5, Nathan, is, what should OSCs look for in selecting a CMMC consultant and an assessor? I guess that's a good segue from our past conversation there.
Sure. So I think it ties back to some of the items we talked about. So, I can never kind of overstate the importance that, these requirements came from NIST 153, right? And so if a team has experience with NIST 153, that's going to greatly inform how they approach the controls. And I think that's really critical so that people are not underprepared. If you think about the security protection assets, I think DoD's intent was pretty clear from the beginning. Yeah, and even NIST intent with NIST 171 that security protection assets were supposed to be assessed against all the applicable controls, which really just means a couple of them aren't included, like encrypting CUI, right? So security protection asset is not supposed to have CUI by classification definition. So therefore, the CUI encryption requirement wouldn't be applicable to a security protection asset. But there was a lot of discussion about, SPAs don't have to be assessed against hardly anything. And I think that came from a lack of understanding of really the way NIST and DoD thinks about things, because I think even NIST 171 was pretty clear on that. So, fast forward, DoD's, the leaked documents seem to confirm that SPAs are supposed to be assessed against the full, suite of CMMC requirements. So I think that's an example where kind of a lack of familiarity can really drive a lot of hype and really just misunderstanding and misinformation.
Yeah, as far as qualifications go, the CMMC, I describe it as sort of being a multidisciplinary, representing a multidisciplinary domain. Obviously, there are components of it that require technical expertise in cybersecurity and security architecture. There are others that require more experience in governance and compliance, and auditing and assessment, if you will, sort of practices. Can you describe the kind of background that OSCs should look for when they're shopping for either a consultant or an assessor that's going to be a good fit for their particular company or business?
Sure, and I'll try to tie it back to the points you made. So, I think experience with governance is certainly helpful, right? Certainly, the larger the organization, the more important the procedures are going to be. For example, things like configuration management practices, right? They tend to be more mature in larger, more sophisticated organizations, and so that governance experience is going to align well with larger organizations. I mentioned the NIST experience, which is certainly helpful. I think, and there's also an important aspect about, the consultant's kind of experience with small, mid, large size companies and how that aligns with the OSC, right? If you typically have somebody who's only worked in a really small company and they're trying to support a really large prime, that may or may not be a good fit, right? They may not understand how large primes do business and how they're structured and how their architectures are. They're certainly likely going to have a much more complex network architecture than a lot of smalls. So I think that background is important, and also thinking about the technology map. For example, if a company is really big on Linux and Mac, does their consultant have any experience with those technologies, or are they going to be totally out of the water?
Yeah, I think that same, line of thinking applies to the OSC's internal team as well. I think you have to stand up a working group that's going to be, focused on CMMC, that includes the competencies that you need internally as well as externally to drive this. And if you staff it with folks that have no background in any of the sort of material or domains, they're going to really struggle to make headway. And so I think I think a consultant can actually assist in that selection process, saying, here's who really should be taking a hands-on role, within the company or the organization, and here's what the consultant is going to do on the external basis. So that's something that I think OSCs should think about as they organize and plan the effort. So we've got a couple of expert insight questions here for you, Nathan, that I just think some folks, frequently ask about. And so the first one is, what is quote unquote FIPS validated encryption? I know that term gets thrown around a lot. Where does it apply? What does it mean?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So just to answer the question of what is FIPS validated encryption first, and then I'll move to kind of where it's required. So FIPS validated encryption it's Federal Information Processing Standard with a series of NIST documents. And what FIPS validated is essentially a lab validation of the encryption algorithm. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because our adversaries could produce an encryption tool or device, right, and sell it quite cheaply, especially to defense industrial-based customers, right? They could actively market that and say it's $1. You can have this amazing firewall. It has VPN, it has everything, and it's $1, right? Go buy it. It's great. And you say, hey, I have encryption. Well, it's not FIPS validated. It hasn't undergone lab assessment. So there's a program that NIST runs that there's a number of certified laboratories, so private companies that are certified by NIST to validate encryption. And companies like Apple Computer, right, send their operating system there, gets validated by the lab, and then eventually they get a certificate number back after there's negotiation between the government and the company. And that's your FIPS certificate number. And that's really important, right? It proves that the encryption in place has been validated by those labs. And you think about it, right? It's supply chain security, right? That you're not using encryption created by an adversary that sold it to, an OSC for $1 so that they could, have access into the organization, a backdoor, right? And that's why that program is in place. There's also allowances for NSA approved cryptography, which is pretty rare, but it's theoretically possible. And so the second question about where it's to be used. So very clearly to protect the confidentiality of CUI. So if you want to use encryption to protect the confidentiality of CUI, it's got to be FIPS validated. So as an example, you have a laptop and you're allowing your users to store CUI on a laptop, and you're saying we're protecting the CUI with encryption. So that encryption has to be FIPS validated. So you've got to make sure that the operating system is using a FIPS validated algorithm. And technically speaking, you should be following the security policy. So every FIPS certificate has instructions of how you're supposed to configure that product. The simplest example is, you set up laptop encryption, but your company policy is to permit the password to be password 1-2. Well, that's not going to be very secure, is it? Because the algorithm might be great, but if I know the password is really simple, clearly an adversary is going to be able to get to that, right? There's obviously favorite example, right, is World War II, right? The German military had this amazing cryptologic device, but the Allies broke it, right? Because the people used the keys as, the name of their girlfriend or their hometown. And so they were able to build, right, the first computers to break this supposedly unbreakable system because the operation of it was not mature, right? The operational piece was weak. It wasn't the technology that was bad, it was the operations. And the same thing applies to FIPS. I don't know whether this will be assessed. I think it should be, but a company should be following the security policy that's available on the NIST website for how to operationalize the FIPS validated cryptographic solution. So there are instructions in there that are approved as part of the documentation as to how you're supposed to configure that. And for example, that's obviously going to prohibit the things of, setting your password to password 1-2, so that, an adversary that picks up the laptop can do very simple password cracking, and they're probably going to try password as the first password and access your CUI. So it's also required where it's used to protect CUI in transit, for example, a VPN. So if you have applications that are not capable of FIPS validated encryption, a remote access VPN is another area where FIPS validated encryption is going to make sense. And there's a really important concept from the federal space here that, the federal government considers encryption that's not FIPS validated to be unencrypted. So you're using whatever encryption that's not FIPS validated. From a documentation perspective, that's unencrypted. People can write it up as it's encrypted, but they shouldn't say that it's FIPS validated because it's not. And in some of the scoring schemes, there's kind of partial points if you're encrypting things not in a FIPS validated manner.
Yeah, so just from a practical standpoint, OSCs that are just sort of becoming familiarized with this terminology or, are just wading into this, how would they know, for example, that, let's say a CUI asset like a laptop is FIPS validated and that the certificate is up to date? Where do they actually obtain that information?
Sure. So I'm sure we can put this link out there. So there's a NIST website called the Cryptographic Module Validation Program. If they do a search for, NIST FIPS validation or NIST CVMP or CMVP, I always get them confused, you will come across the website. So it's CMVP, and there is actually a search, and you can search by vendor and module name. So well, the simplest example might be, Windows, right? BitLocker. And if that's your laptop, there's a security policy that my recollection of it is it requires you to have Windows in FIPS mode. So that's a registered key, or you can set it with group policy or Intune to be in FIPS mode when you enable BitLocker. So theoretically, you'd want to be able to show an assessor that you had FIPS mode on, and then you turned BitLocker on, and that's part of the security policy that BitLocker was configured with FIPS validated keys because FIPS mode was on when you turned on BitLocker. If you have BitLocker already running and then you turned on FIPS mode later, there's not a guarantee that your password login methods are in line with the security policy. So, that kind of goes back to the security policy idea. So, obviously you can search, your vendor is Microsoft. You can search the version, right? It's a security policy, and it's going to have details about which version of the software was tested. It'll be in the certificate, should be in the certificate details as well. So which version of Windows, you can compare that to your version of Windows with WinVer and look at those, look at your audit logs for when did you turn on FIPS mode and when did you turn on BitLocker. And then if you look through the security policy, you'll see the other requirements to set it up. There's generally restrictions in products with essentially what options can be used in FIPS mode. Some products will just automatically disable the unallowable things. Other products, the user is responsible, or the cryptographic administrator or the system administrator is responsible for disabling those functions. So it just depends on the products. And then this kind of gets into the challenge with patching, right? So unfortunately, the government has changed the FIPS program to have a new standard. So there's 140-2, and there were modules approved under that kind of regime, and some of those are still valid. And they released a major update to the program called FIPS 140-3, which is essentially just a new standard. And so you have a lot of vendors trying to get new products and updated under the new regime. So there's a huge backlog of modules that are in process. They're undergoing evaluation, or they're undergoing the kind of back and forth between the government and the vendor. So you end up as an OSC in this predicament where a specific version of the software, say Windows or Mac, is FIPS validated, so it applies to that exact version. And then, of course, the vendors always release security updates, right? So what do? Do you patch to fix the security updates, or do you stay on the exact version that's FIPS validated? Most organizations are going to do a risk assessment and capture a POAM in their security documentation and say, look, this is a high severity vulnerability. It can be remotely exploited. We have to patch, right? We have to patch. Oftentimes, what you can do as part of that risk assessment is, you think about the version of the software, right? If you're going from version 10 to version 11, for example, in Windows, there's obviously going to be another FIPS certificate for version 11 of Windows, right? If you're staying within version 10, you've got to look at the version numbering and try to upgrade to a reasonable version that's still in the same, kind of minor version if you can, right? Say, okay, well, yes, Microsoft has patched these vulnerabilities, but they're not changing the core functionality, especially around crypto in this version. And with things like firewalls and so forth, it's often a little easier to tell because they might have version 2, right? They FIPS validated version 2.1, and now it's 2.1.1. Well, it seems pretty clear that that's a minor version update, right? It's 2.1.0 to 2.1.1. That applying that patch is probably a pretty low risk thing. You read the notes and there's no update to the encryption algorithms. You're probably going to do an internal risk assessment and say, yep, that's reasonable. We're going to apply that patch. Now someone comes along and the network administrator says, hey, there's some new whiz-bang functionality in version 3 of the firewall. Well, is there a FIPS certificate for version 3? Maybe not. So you might need to stay on the 2 series, but review the updates that are available and try to patch where that makes sense. So that obviously gets complex. Certainly, consultants and others can help with those discussions. And, this ties into the overall process of CMMC, right? So you have the ability to have POAMs. So you might have a POAM there that, we had to patch because we had to remediate the vulnerability. We understand that exact version is not FIPS validated, and the assessors are going to understand that, right? I mean, the vendors don't send every minor version to FIPS validation. They would never, the government would, approved labs would never get through it, right? Because there are so many software updates. But it's a balance between, making major changes they're probably not going to be defensible, right? Are going to be really hard to defend, or reasonable patches that you have well-reasoned evidence and justification for.
Yeah, those are some excellent insights that, I think illustrate sort of the amount of detail and background knowledge that, individuals have to have when looking at some of these issues. Because, understanding sort of the nuance in terms of patching and its relationship to FIPS is something that the average, even IT administrator that many companies would rely heavily on for, some of these functions would not necessarily have unless they had, a background in federal sort of work. So I think that's great and very helpful. All right, Nathan. So this is the last question of the interview, and it's another expert insight, and it concerns MFA. So I'm just going to kick this one to you and let you explain what it is and where it's required.
Sure. So what is MFA? So MFA is multi-factor authentication. There's a great, if you really want to dig into MFA and you're responsible for OSC's implementation, there's a great document. It's not necessarily required, but has a lot of insight into where the government is coming from. It's on NIST 163-3. There's a series of documents that have letters as well. And it boils down to 2 separate items of authentication. So if you think about a password is something that and a device is something you have, or a biometric is something that you are. So that's an example of 3 factors there, right? The biometric, the device, and the password. So multi-factor is essentially requiring 2 or more. So where is it required? There's probably a bit of divergence on this. Obviously, you should work with consultants and assessors to get the answer for your specific system. But it's generally understood to be required in CUI devices and security protection assets. So just putting up the exact control here so we can just go through it in the context of that control. So one of the key controls is IA.L2.353. So this kind of gets to the complexity of CMMC. So you've got to identify your privileged accounts. So, and this is why I'm just speaking kind of hypothetically, right? So if we assume, you have a firewall that has a remote access VPN, well, probably the account that can manage that firewall is going to be a privileged account in a normal circumstance. So your network administrator logs into that firewall. You might permit them to log in outside of the VPN because maybe the VPN is down, right? They're managing the VPN. So they might be allowed to log into that firewall externally from home. So that connection with a network administrator is going to log in, would be required to have multi-factor authentication. So that's network access to privileged accounts. That's letter C in that requirement. For example, your users creating a VPN session remotely. So that's network access for non-privileged accounts. That's D. So they're going to be required to have multi-factor authentication. you have local access to privileged accounts. So your system administrator is going to log into a server that contains, CUI or performs some other security function. They're going to need multi-factor authentication on that account.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation. I think a lot of companies now are saying that they quote unquote do MFA, right? But I don't think that many of them have looked at MFA granularly, nor have they considered that, some types of authentication, while maybe, requiring additional sort of verification, are not truly MFA as is required by CMMC. Is that a fair statement?
It is, and you get into this situation where people say, okay, so let's say I have, MFA required on the VPN. How often do I have to prompt the user for MFA, right? So if I log into the VPN, can I just work all day? Can I log into multiple, firewalls? Can I log into servers without MFA? Well, it's a good question, and I think it gets into this compliance versus security discussion. From a strict compliance perspective, is there technically MFA before you can log into the for example, the server behind the VPN? Yeah, technically. Is that a reasonable risk decision for a company that's got a bunch of sensitive data and multi-billion-dollar contracts? It doesn't really sound like a very reasonable risk decision to me, because it ties into for example, the AU controls. So if I'm supposed to be able to conduct a forensic investigation, and somebody was logged into the to the VPN for 8 hours, and maybe their screen doesn't lock for 20 minutes, and they were at home, can you prove who logged into that firewall if MFA is not prompted for at that login? It's just a tough position to be in if you're trying to go to what some may perceive to be the bare minimum. I mean, I think the general consensus is that you're supposed to have MFA being prompted for login at every logon to a security protection asset, right? A CUI asset. So if you're authenticating the VPN, that's great. But if you've got a firewall behind there where your administrator is doing some work, they should be prompted for MFA before logging into that firewall as well. And obviously, if DoD changes, their view of this and they publish it, right, that's great. But at this point, people, I think, are relying on what the general consensus is, and to some extent, what DIBCAC is doing. Although I, caution listeners that, ultimately, as we noted before, DIBCAC is not conducting CMMC assessments. So ultimately, the C3POs should be able to stand on their own without referring to what DIBCAC has done, because it's not, to my knowledge, controlling precedent, for C3POs. I mean, the CMMC program is under, the DoD CMMC program management, and DIBCAC is under their hierarchy for all the evaluations that they do. So they're kind of doing CMMC assessments as a favor to the program management office. They're not under the same controlling guidance within DoD. So ultimately, DoD should release documents stating that people should follow DIBCAC precedent if that's their intent.
Yeah, no, and it's exactly that kind of insight that, again, highlights the value of having someone who, is immersed in this space and is familiar with, how these requirements will arise, be interpreted, and applied in various contexts. Because I just think, OSCs that really want to get this done, and they want to do it in an efficient way, rather than sort of, trying to accumulate all this, inside knowledge and sort of necessary perspective that you'd have to navigate some of this, quickly and efficiently, there really is value in just, working with somebody who already knows it, whose job it is to track this stuff and be able to convey it to you in a very succinct way and implement it and deploy it in a way that you need to. So Nathan, this interview has been packed with valuable insights and information. So we very much appreciate all the tips and tricks that you've outlined along the way.
Certainly very much enjoyed the conversation. And certainly, as we've noted, right, things are so fact specific. So please don't interpret our discussion to mean anything in terms of a CMMC assessment for an individual OSC.
Absolutely, duly noted. Well, this concludes this installment of Relic Law's Interview with an Expert series. Nathan, thank you again for your time. And if you want to learn more about Relic Law's cybersecurity or CMMC practice, you can visit our website at reliclawpllc.com. See you next time.